The recording has started. So Sharon, we welcome you to present, and we will pass the baton over to you right now. We'll hold Q&A until after the presentation, and then just for everyone who is attending, there is going to be a video recording of this as well as Sharon's presentation made available on NCST's website, and I'll share those details in the chat. Thank
Right.
you all so much.
Thank you so much, Raquel. And thank you for the NCSD team for just, it's been so great to work on all kinds of issues together and to come here in this sort of briefing as well, community impact briefing. So let me share my screen so you can follow along. So yeah, super excited to talk about my experience in Detroit here, and to talk about my book, which came out just in November of last year. So it's called The Last House on the Block. And this book started, as Raquel was sort of saying, started when I was doing my PhD in sociology at Princeton University, and I knew that I wanted to do this sort of in-depth study of a community. I knew I wanted to like live in a city somewhere and really understand everyday neighborhood life by really spending time there and getting to know residents. But at that time, I wasn't quite sure where where I wanted to live. So as I was thinking about this. Detroit was actually in the news a lot. This was like around 2014. And this was, Detroit was just going through historical bankruptcy at the time, the largest municipal bankruptcy in US history. And all of a sudden, Detroit was propelled into national and international headlines. And I just sort of, I kept reading about Detroit, even though I was living in New York City at the time. So as I was reading about Detroit from this distance away, there seems to be kind of only two main storylines about the city. And I think it's important for not just Detroit, but thinking about what storylines are available for cities, right? Like how are cities often reduced to one story or another? In the case of Detroit, it seemed to be either this sort of storyline of Detroit as murder capital, a place where almost everyone had left. These stories about Detroit as sort of murder capital often erased the around 700,000 people that still called this place home, the majority of whom were Black, right? So this is sort of erasure of Black lives and communities in Detroit. And on the other hand, and this was a more recent storyline, as Detroit was going through bankruptcy and kind of new investments were pouring into the city again, especially downtown. There was this new storyline about Detroit as the place to be, the place for both Michigan billionaires and Brooklyn millennials to kind of to go to and to move to, and even the sort of the idea that Detroit would be the next stop on the L train. The L train is the subway line in Brooklyn where a lot of gentrification has taken place historically. This idea that this would be the place where gentrifiers were moving next. So as I was reading this, I thought, huh, this is super interesting. None of these two storylines really rings true to me. This is highly reductive. It's very much connected to how we think about this country, between the connection between race and value and property value, right? It's a very reductive story. So I thought, well, there's more to this story. I think there's a book here. So I decided, I want to know what's going on behind the headlines. What is it actually like to live in one of Detroit's depopulated neighborhoods right now? So, um, you know, the sort of intuition was even more affirmed when I even started seeing billboards about Detroit in my own neighborhood in Bushwick. I was living in Bushwick in Brooklyn at the time, and this narrative just kind of kept popping up, right? As sort of Detroit as sort of the next place to be, the place where vacancy was kind of waiting for newcomers. Um, so yeah, somehow this story became connected to where I was living too. So as I said, I decided to move to Detroit, and specifically, I did not want to move to the sort of downtown neighborhoods that were getting the most dollars and attention, and that were sort of a very small part of of the entirety of Detroit, like a small minority of Detroiters were living in downtown. So I decided to move to the Brightmoor neighborhood in Detroit instead, which is in Northwest Detroit. You can see it outlined in black here on this map. So, you know, where you see the name Detroit, that's kind of where the downtown is, right at the riverfront. So Brightmoor was pretty far from that. It was like about a 20-minute drive on the highway to go from Brightmoor to downtown Detroit. So it was a lot more kind of a common experience of a very depopulated, one of the most depopulated areas of Detroit. So Brightmoor was a neighborhood that had been through more than 50 years of decline by the time I moved there. It had always been this kind of working class neighborhood with a lot of kind of small bungalows. It always had more of a suburban feel almost, given that, you know, there's a lot of kind of little single family homes next to each other. But starting in the 1970s, it saw a very steep depopulation, driven mainly by white flight, white long-timers kind of leaving Brightmoor to buy homes that were available to them in the suburbs, but a route that was blocked for Black Detroiters because of redlining and discrimination. So, you know, since the 1970s, uh, Brightmoor had declined more than 60% in population, and it turned from virtually all white to 83% black during those decades. There was like around one in three to one in two families lived in poverty. So there was a fairly high poverty rate in Brightmoor. But I think what was most, specific about Brightmoor was just how depopulated it had become over that time. So by the time I moved into Brightmoor, this was in 2015, every third house, every other property had become an empty vacant lot, and every third house that remained standing was empty, right? So there's more grass in this neighborhood than homes at this time, and every third house stood vacant. So there was a lot of vacancy as well as blight in this neighborhood. Another kind of interesting thing about this neighborhood was that since 2006, it had become a destination for white newcomers as well. This was very different than what was happening in downtown Detroit or kind of the downtown gentrification that we may be familiar with. It was a small group they called themselves urban farmers, a group of people, most of whom were white, who were attracted to Brightmoor because of its emptiness and its vacancy. So they were drawn to Brightmoor because there are so many fields, and they started to convert those fields into gardens and farms. And they bought some of it's dirt cheap real estate, right? You could buy homes in Brightmoor at the time starting at $500, but really, you know, sometimes people bought a house for $1 or $400. Like there was really, you know, the property market was completely collapsed. So these white newcomers kind of saw opportunity here in a neighborhood that so many before them had left. So during I lived in the Brightmoor neighborhood from 2015 to 2018, so for 3 years, and I was an ethnographer. So an ethnographer is someone who really tries to become part of the community that they study as much as possible, and tries to meet as many people as possible, and you know, create relationships with people locally to really understand how they kind of perceive the conditions that are facing them, right? Like, what is it like to live in a neighborhood like that? What is it like to be a homeowner, owning a home that may only be worth $5,000, right? What is it like to have seen your neighborhood change over, you know, 3, 4, 5 decades of decline, and to sort of see this gradual deterioration and loss, as well as the violence that came with decline? Like, how did people cope with that? So during these 3 years, I just put myself in as many spaces as I could. So I would hang out at the farmers market that the newcomers started in Brightmoor. I would, you know, shop locally to the extent that was possible, right? Like, go to the corner store, eat with people, go to the soup kitchen. Um, I spent a lot of time doing tax foreclosure prevention, boarding up homes, just kind of hanging out with people, driving around the neighborhood with different residents. So just, a variety of activity. As an ethnographer, your everyday life becomes research, basically, right? So especially when you live in a neighborhood. So, as I said, I after 1 year of living in a neighborhood, I also purchased a home myself. The picture on the right is actually a picture of the home that I owned and where I lived in Brightmoor, and I was able to buy this house for $7,000 in cash, and this was a very normal price in Brightmoor at the time. And the fact that I needed cash was also very normal because it was virtually impossible to get a mortgage for properties that were so much devalued, right? So, ironically, as an outsider with cash, I was better positioned to buy a home than many Detroiters, were because most people did not have $7,000 in cash on the bank to be able to buy this kind of home. Um, so I used that experience of buying a home, of owning a home, and then selling it again to a local family to also better understand, the property market and to better understand home ownership. For example, I had to stand in line for 5 hours at the water department to get my water connected as a new homeowner. Because city institutions were failing and so many Detroiters were getting their water shut off at the time. It was very difficult for me to get homeowners insurance. A lot of people did not have homeowners insurance, partly because it was pretty expensive for the low property values. And I really struggled to sell my house at the end of at the end of my field work because I did not want to sell it to an investor, and those are the people that generally have cash, right? So, I write about all these experiences in my book as well, and they gave me even more insight into the kind of the local housing market. Um, Part of the reason why the property market was so collapsed in Brightmoor at the time was because of the tax foreclosure system in Detroit, and the city was going through a tax foreclosure crisis at the time. So a lot of Detroiters had lost their home in a decade before during the subprime mortgage crisis. But there was a sort of second wave of home loss happening, like around 2015 was the peak when I moved. Um, and a lot of Detroiters were losing their homes because they fell behind on taxes. And once they fell behind, the state and the county charged really prohibitively high fees and interest rates, making it even harder for people to catch up. And a lot of people did not know about kind of payment plans that were available. So it's part of the work I did to kind of try to bring legal aid attorneys into the neighborhood and make people aware of ways that they could save their home. But that sort of was the background of why homes were so cheap in this community. Um, so, the book is about these 3 years that I spent in Brightmoor, but it's not about me. It's about the residents of Brightmoor and their experiences, and both what gentrification kind of looked like, and the experiences of longtimers. So when we think about cities, or when you read about cities, so like in newspapers, or, there's often this focus on cities like Boston or New York City or San Francisco, cities that are very successful, that are growing, where rents are rising, that are very dense in population, where streets often have sort of mixed uses, right? So there's residential and commercial are mixed. There's an extensive public transportation network, and sort of the main kind of challenge of these cities is really gentrification and like becoming more and more unaffordable, and sort of the sort of population pressures of being a growing city. But well, that's not the only type of urbanism that's out there, and it's not the kind of only type of urban situation that is very common. There's another kind of type of city out there, and cities that are struggling, that may be losing population, where home values still struggle, especially in certain communities, and that often like are not like kind of the walkable kind of super dense cities that we often think about. So um, Detroit is not an outlier here. Detroit is not alone, and I think a lot of people on the call like are very aware, but I think a lot of people across the country may not be so aware. A lot of cities that so this map shows all cities that lost population between 2000 and 2020, and the cities that are labeled on the map lost at least 10% of population during that time. So you see that there's a whole host of cities, including a lot of smaller to medium-sized cities, both in sort of the northeast, kind of Midwest corridor, but then also kind of former agricultural hubs in the south that lost population and that are continuing to lose population, right? So the book is kind of a story about what it's like to live in such a city. What is it like to live in such a neighborhood, right? The sort of untold story of urban life today that is not unique to Detroit, even though Detroit is often sort of the best known example of it. So with that, I answered two key questions in my book. On the one hand, kind of what does urban life look like, right, in such a depopulated neighborhood? How is it different to be a homeowner in a declining neighborhood? How do people think about violence and safety in streets that have so few homes left, right? That just are not that dense anymore. So what does the urban experience of safety look like and feel like in such a place? How do people think about nature and vacancy? Like, what are residents' perceptions of vacant homes, right? Like, how do they cope with that? And how does kind of the experience of going through decline kind of shape people's opportunities and the way that they see their neighborhood and the way that they experience also think about the future of the neighborhood and what they'd like to see in the future, right? So these are all uh, kind of stories and sort of answers that I get at it through my book and through the stories in my book. You kind of get to know that kind of experience of living through decline through the stories and the voices of residents. And then the second key question of the book is, what does gentrification look like in such a place, right? We often think about gentrification, um, as being driven by very heavy top-down investments, as something that once gentrification starts, it can never fail, right? Once the first like white woman with yoga pants shows up in some neighborhood, it's already done, right? It's too late, right? We're thinking about this as almost sort of a natural, almost like an inevitable kind of process of change that is really hard to stop once it starts. But it doesn't have to, like very few things in life are inevitable, right? So, and gentrification is the same, right? It doesn't always succeed. Sometimes it starts, but it can fail, right? So, by kind of showing the case of Brightmoor and sort of how in Brightmoor we see this early influx of white newcomers that were buying property, they were renaming, rebranding part of the neighborhood, they're starting a farmers market, right? So it's sort of we see the early starts, but not all the conditions were in place for gentrification to actually launch, right? So kind of really unpacking what gentrification is and is not, and how it proceeds differently in conditions of extreme decline and disinvestment. So you know, two key takeaways. If there's only two takeaways from this presentation, is that I show throughout my book that gentrification is not inevitable. Like it's not this sort of um, you know, self-fulfilling prophecy that just sort of happens and will always transform a neighborhood. I think it's really important, partly because I see a lot of kind of smaller cities and sort of mayors think about gentrification as like the only way to revitalize their city or to revitalize neighborhoods. But we know that it comes with very deep inequalities and it also doesn't always succeed, right? Like it's not enough to sort of say, well, let's just attract some middle class people and then the rest will kind of take care of itself. Like I really unpack like what gentrification needs and like why those conditions were not in place in Brightmoor and why it therefore failed. And then the second key takeaway is that like we don't talk enough like about neighborhoods decline. Like I think over the last decade, people have talked a lot about Detroit, but they've always framed Detroit as this weird outlier, this extreme case, where, this sort of singular example of a city that failed, almost, but it's not unique at all, right? Even though, you know, in many other places, neighborhood decline is taking place at a smaller scale. There's a lot of communities across the country that still struggle. We just don't often hear about it because journalists don't happen to live in those places, or, not a lot of people visit Brightmoor, just for its own sake, right? Like you wouldn't really go there if you don't live there, right? So there's a lot of communities like that are just not getting the same kind of attention as a place like Brooklyn would, for example. Um, Neighborhood decline shapes people's opportunities in its own way. We often think about, at least in sociology, there's a lot of talk about how neighborhood poverty, like growing up in a poor neighborhood, can really impact your opportunities. But there's something unique about living in a declining community that's even separate from living in a poor community, right? And the very experience of decline, of course, also fosters poverty, right? So there's something unique about that experience, and it comes with unique challenges for community development too. That's different from just trying to tackle poverty, so like we don't talk about this enough in the academic literature, and I don't think we talk about it enough to sort of really understand the sort of modal experience of a lot of urban residents outside of these major cities. So I think that's another key takeaway of my book, is to really put a spotlight on this experience, and to really give texture to the experience. So it's not just something that's abstract, but something that's really real based on people's stories. So it's always difficult to kind of give you a sense of the stories in the book, because there's so many stories in the book. But to kind of close off my presentation before we go to Q&A, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one chapter, and do a little reading for my book, so you kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. So one chapter in the book is really about how residents look at nature after decline? How do people look at the greenery, the lush greenery that sort of sprung in the place of departures and sort of demolitions, right? So there's a picture here that was sort of a street corner in Brightmoor, where the grass grew really tall. And a lot of residents, as I was living in Brightmoor, I realized people kept talking to me, and I kept running into people that were mowing the grass. Mowing the grass was really, really important in Brightmoor, and it was a really important activity for people. And there were a lot of sort of anxieties about the future of the neighborhood that were tied up to the grass, basically. Um, like people would mow lands that they didn't even own, right? They would kind of mow land that was owned by investors or by the city, um, in order to kind of create some sense of order and control in a neighborhood that so often felt outside of people's control. Um, you know, People had a lot of pride. Like I owned a home at some point, and my neighbors would sort of eye me and to make sure that I would, maintain my grass in my front lawn. And they did so even though kind of, three houses down from us, there was kind of a burned out house that recently had experienced arson, right? So um, in a neighborhood where there's so much, vacancy and blight, grass was one way that residents could kind of control their sense of what an urban neighborhood should look like, right? So for long-timers, grass was also connected to their sense of like what an urban neighborhood should look like, and a sort of urban neighborhood that they wanted Brightmoor to be once again. Uh, for the white newcomers in Brightmoor, they saw the same field very differently, right? They would look at this field and they would say, wow, look how beautiful this wildflower field is. It's almost like we live in a country. It's so beautiful, right? So their relationship to nature was very different. Like they did not have an urban relationship to nature. They wanted nature to overtake Brightmoor even more. And so they did not want to mow the grass in many instances, right? They wanted it to grow lush. Um, so there's a lot of layers to this sort of relationship to vacancy, right? If we look at a vacant lot, like there's a lot of layers of meaning if you look at it from the resident's point of view, right? These lots were rarely ever truly empty. So I'm just going to do a quick reading from the chapter 4 of my book to kind of give you a sense of how longtimers looked at a field like this. Many longtimers looked at vacant fields through the lens of memories, seeing in them places in the neighborhood that they had lost. Miss Donna recalled how Hubert School's playground was one beautifully maintained and filled with kids, as she now looked over grounds that were overgrown and quietened, as Hubert School had long been closed down. For Pamela, one of my neighbors, the weedy city alley behind her house, a thoroughfare for cats and the occasional raccoon, became a memory lane as she recalled her dad's car repair business that had once faced this alley that now was just an overgrown, it was basically a forest. Longtimers' most powerful memories often came from their childhoods. Because of the timing of Brightmoor's racial turnover, more white than black longtimers had grown up in the neighborhood. Benjamin was a 45-year-old, white, born and raised Brightmoor resident. Short and stout, Benjamin had a long, blonde, two-pronged beard, short hair, and tattoos on his neck and hands. His deep blue eyes were penetrating, and his guttural laugh was contagious. He called himself a biker, though he wasn't a member of one of Brightmoor's motorcycle gangs. While he sometimes got into aggressive arguments with male neighbors, behind his foul language and tough front, he could show himself vulnerable and protective. After I visited him and his girlfriend one rainy morning, he made sure to watch me walk to my car, joking, "I'll see you out. Make sure that a raccoon or a squirrel isn't mugging you." One day, Benjamin gave me a tour of Brightmoor in his Dodge pickup truck. He sighed when he showed me an area of Brightmoor where he grew up. Um, he said, "Now, this is my street where I grew up on and where I used to walk to school. We actually lived here. We lived in a little harder section over here. There's nothing left over here, you'll see. This is, we used to walk up to the end of the street over here, and we used to walk up to the school this way there. We were on the other side of Birds." He said, "This used to be a park for the kids. BMX biking was huge when we were kids, so we used it as a BMX track." So these vacated streets became imbued with meaning for Benjamin, as he recalled routes where he was used to walk to school, to another Detroit school that was now closed and boarded up, and he pointed out this vacant lot that once doubled as an informal BMX track. Vacancy had long been a part of Detroit's streets and had long been creatively repurposed by residents. So me and Benjamin then drove on to the site of his childhood home, which also had become a field of grass. But Benjamin had no trouble finding it, as he was helped by a tree that still stood in the landscape. He said, "This was our house over here. I remember this tree distinctly because that's a tree that we used to play in. We used to play ball in this field. It was always an empty lot that was here, and we lived at this house right here. This was a house right here. We lived right on the corner." So for many long-timers, these now vacant fields were not truly vacant as memories continued to haunt these sites, what sociologist Michael Bell also calls the ghost of place. When long-timers looked at the neighborhood, they remember houses, households, and events that had transpired in specific places, specters of Brightmoor of a different era, a Brightmoor before depopulation. Many of these sites now only remain as fields. There were no official memorials to the slow violence of depopulation in Brightmoor. This shows that this is just one example of sort of, if you look at one field that we may call an empty field, there's just so many layers of meaning that remain there for residents. And that were not only tied up with the past of Brightmoor, but also how they imagined and dreamt of its future, right? Kind of a future where they wanted to see, they continue to see themselves as urban residents, and they wanted sort of a denser urban future for the neighborhood again. So I'll open it up for questions, but thank you again for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Sharon, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. for walking us through this, all of your all of the wonderful explanation of your own experience, and then certainly sharing that portion of the book. Raquel, if it sounds good, we'll move right into questions.
Sure thing. Thank you. Thanks.
Fantastic. It's also I just want to note this wasn't a particular question, but Kim Booker, one of our attendees, noted that this sounds an awful lot like Trenton. I think Trenton, New Jersey, and was adding that note right at the same time that you were pulling up your map of the U.S. and showing that, in fact, Detroit is not so dissimilar from many
Mhm.
places in
Yeah.
America, and having this perspective of depopulation, vacancy, etc. All right, so first question here. Wondering if there were any innovative approaches taken by the residents or maybe community organizations based in Detroit or Brightmoor specifically to create new uses for blighted land that felt like viable alternatives rather than making the land more available to private developers and encouraging gentrification.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I mean the Detroit Land Bank had sort of an innovative program to sell side lots to Detroiters for $100. I actually, when I was an intern at the Detroit Land Bank, I had to approve deeds and like mail deeds to people for that were they for a side lot for $100. So a lot of residents, well, especially a lot of homeowners, sort of really valued that program and sort of oftentimes, there was a like there's a long trajectory, right? So there's a house next door that becomes empty, then it becomes owned by the Detroit Land Bank, and then it needs to be demolished, and then it becomes a side lot that they can buy for $100. But it was a way for people to also feel, um, they already felt that sense of ownership over a lot of their block. Like I'm showing them mowing the street, right? So it was a way to sort of kind of reward that sense of ownership a little bit more and have them give even more control over it. I mean it's complicated because I think for a lot of the longtime residents, they did not necessarily want just more parks or more farms and gardens, right? Like many of them were sort of waiting for maybe infill or like actual kind of housing development. But that wasn't really happening in Brightmoor because it was not in such a large city with so many struggling neighborhoods. Brightmoor was kind of low on the list of priority for the city, right? As they were trying to direct the limited funds that were available to sort of more kind of the middle neighborhoods, right? That NCSD works on too, where every dollar of investment perhaps had more leverage than in such a depopulated place. Yeah.
Sure, and that's such an interesting perspective. And I think back to I lived and worked in Detroit when I was first getting my start in community development. And while we didn't necessarily call it this in the early 2000s, in hindsight, I think the vernacular was vacant land reuse. And it had a suggestion, right, that those activities were interim, right? That these were about
Mm,
stabilizing communities as they would shift. But I wonder at this point in history if in fact the way that you experience Brightmoor and maybe the way that you would see it here in 2026 is in fact the new urban fabric, right? Is that actually what Brightmoor
mhm.
is for, say, the next 50 years?
Yeah.
Or would you rather see it? Do you actually see it more as I think we were describing it, say, 20 years ago, as kind of an interim use and something that was about to shift into a different type of community?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because for a lot of residents that had a whole they had stayed in their neighborhood throughout all of this decline and they held onto property that was worthless, right? Their home ownership was draining their wealth rather than building their wealth, right? So if you own a house that's worth $5,000, any kind of maintenance that you have to put into it is gonna be like, a new roof, maybe more expensive than your house, right? So you're just sort of you're not building equity over time as your home value is not really going up, right? So a lot of them were sort of hoping for that moment, Chris, that you're talking about of change, right? They had seen Then Gilbert really reinvest in downtown Detroit. White people, like white kind of farmers, were moving into their neighborhoods. So they're like, okay, this is gentrification starting here. So they were kind of also holding on to property. They're kind of like, well, in any other city, like my house would sell for $1 million, right? Like when is my $1 million coming, right? Like when is my home ownership paying off, right? So I think um, there was sort of this hope that there would be an end to this interim period, right? Like it's like hopefulness of the people who stayed. But now, in my conclusion of the book, is based on when I visited again in 2023. So it kind of brings Brightmoor into the present, and it became even emptier than before, right? So it did not see this sort of redevelopment, right? It's not temporary if something is happening for 50 years, right? It's not a temporary reality. So one thing that we're seeing, and this is sort of at the very end of the book, I talk about this, is that the city is sort of thinking about new uses for kind of urban infrastructure. So when I visited Detroit, in 2025, they started the process of kind of eminent domain and selling out some residents in the most depopulated part of Brightmoor, and they're going to build kind of water retention ponds as a way to kind of better deal with stormwater kind of overflow from the Rouge River to better prevent kind of to help both people in the suburbs and Detroiters against kind of flooding basements and like overflowing streets, right? So that's another kind of use of Brightmoor lands. And I think it could help sort of, especially if it's done in a nice way, it could like kind of become like a Lake Brightmoor almost that then can become an amenity later, right? So I think it is very it's very complicated in Detroit because it's in such a large scale. But I think it's fair to say like, I don't expect um Brightmoor to be different like 10 years from now, right? It has taken 50 years and it may take a very long time for it to stabilize once again. Yeah.
Mm. No, it's such an interesting perspective, and just really reinforces a point that was so prescient in your book and in your comments that hip, strong market places are not the only definition of urbanism. That
Mhm.
the experience that you had, and then as you're describing this, this future possibility of sort of redesign of the city is also a definition of urban America.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question here, urban decline impacting Black African American communities is incredibly complicated. The history of redlining cannot be separated from the 2008 economic debacle, ongoing state level disinvestment, the pandemic, and other major cut to Black community fabrics. The questionnaire notes that my extended family history has long roots in Detroit. And if the story of economic social disinvestment could really be told, it would fill many books. I wonder if you have any reactions to those comments.
No, I think that is right. That is right. And I think it's also complicated. Like in the introduction of my book, I sort of set up this history, but there's just so if we're thinking about how racism impacted declining cities, it's just so many moments, right? It's like, we're talking about the tax foreclosure crisis. We're talking about selectively closing schools, particularly in Black neighborhoods, right? Or disinvesting in schools in Black neighborhoods. We're talking about the subprime, kind of the reverse redlining during the subprime mortgage crisis. There's just so many layers of disinvestment was not one decision. It was like all these different layers, and I try to um, weave that into the storyline as much as possible. And I think also with this question, and I didn't say that when I showed the map, but I do say that in my book in more depth, is that the questioner is right. The experience of urban decline remains a predominantly Black experience, right? This is not a kind of race neutral kind of thing that keeps happening. It predominantly impacts Black neighborhoods and sort of cities where more residents are Black, right? So when we think about racial inequality in the United States today or racial inequality in cities, we shouldn't just talk about gentrification. We should also talk about urban decline because it really shapes like even whether people can benefit from home ownership or the quality of the schools or whether you feel safe in your community and you kind of feel like you can engage with your community and walk on the street and all those things, right? And so there's a lot that's tied up with uh, urban decline and your opportunity as a resident in these places. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Sort of building on that similar idea, a question here about local politics. Questioner notes that he lives in St. Louis, and there's far more neighborhood decline, communities in neighborhood decline rather than gentrification there in St. Louis. But the
Yeah.
politics of the city don't necessarily reflect that. Curious if that's true in Detroit and how it can be addressed. Is there a sort of
Mhm.
a political awareness around decline as well as gentrifying neighborhoods?
Yeah. Um, yeah, so Detroit recently got a new mayor, Mary Sheffield. She was a city councilor for over a decade, so she's very, very aware of the sort of neighborhood. In Detroit, they talk about downtown versus the neighborhoods, right? So she's very aware and has been very much part of sort of the texture of neighborhood organizing, and she's been part of tax foreclosure prevention. So I'm hoping that with her, it seems that under the previous mayor, Mayor Duggan, there was more kind of focus on, turning the city around by really investing in downtown and sort of reconstituting that downtown as an attractive place for investors. Um, and under his tenure, the main kind of funding going into the neighborhoods was demolition funds, right? So which is very important. Like the demolition has been very important for even just safety and kind of feeling like something is happening on your block. I think we're turning into this new phase for Detroit where it's more like, okay, what can we do for the neighborhoods beyond demolition, right? Like what can we? I think I've seen in Mayor Sheffield's program that she's also focusing on how homeownership preservation, like making sure that Detroiters that live in these neighborhoods can stay in their home and that they're not one disaster away from losing their home because their basement keeps flooding and there's mold in their basement or something like that, or their roof is collapsing, right? So this I'm really encouraged by this by this shift. But yeah, I think in many cities there's a tension, right? Because it's also like there's only so many investment dollars to go around, and it is true, like most attention to Detroit will be focused on, campus marshes and like the stadium, it won't be, people won't be visiting Brightmoor generally, right? So I think that that's a tension too, in terms of the local politics. But yeah, I appreciate that. And I think it'd be really interesting to think about what it looks like in different cities, in small and large cities. It's going to look very differently. Yeah.
Wonderful. Sharon, thanks so much. Raquel, I'll turn it back to you, but really appreciated this conversation with Sharon today.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you so
thanks.
much.
Thanks, Chris. Actually, Sharon, we've got two more questions and comments in the chat. So let me just bring those to you. This first one is there anything that you think would bring people back into their community when there has been intense decline? How do you convince businesses to want to come into these areas to help economic development, like well-known grocery stores as an example? So your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Um, I mean, one promising thing that I've seen is sort of there has been some immigration, kind of like Ethiopian kind of community, for example, kind of into neighborhoods like Brightmoor. So sort of that's another source of revitalization. It's not just like the white gentrifiers or whatever, but sort of immigrant communities, like, at least historically. Part of the reason why Detroit is sort of such an extreme case is because it hasn't seen as much immigration as many other cities, right? So, kind of, I mean, it's tough to do right now, but like, kind of that is one way of stimulating that. I think for a strategy that I've seen successful is just kind of community organizers being really persistent for a decade, in sort of being brokers for the community almost, in sort of negotiating with supermarkets or businesses, that it's worth to invest, like that it's possible to invest in their community, and that there's demand there, and right. So I think part of what a lot of these cities have to overcome is just stigma and sort of the idea that, it's too unsafe or, too violent or whatever to locate in these communities, right? And that's not necessarily true, right? Like that's like it's very cities have also become a lot more safe. The reputation of Detroit, I think, is based on the 70s, right? And like all cities have become more safe, including Detroit, including Brightmoor, right? So how can we break that stigma? I think is part of the solution too. Yeah.
Thank you. And just a quick comment and then a final, we'll take that. There's one final question and a comment, and then we'll move on to policy updates. This comment coming from Peter, the comment about homeowners holding on is interesting. When working in a neighborhood going through some modest gentrifications about 20 years ago, he was struck by the difference in attitude towards the changes. Homeowners were generally happy to have their houses have more value again, but
Mhm.
renters were justifiably worried. So
Yeah.
comment there. I don't know if you want to respond to that. And then one more question for you.
No, I appreciate that comment. It's really interesting. I mean, it's like once you see it somewhere, you kind of see it everywhere, right? Sort of
Yeah, definitely.
ambivalent feelings towards gentrification. And one thing I can say is that when I came back to Brightmoor in 2023 and 2025, like home values have gone up a little bit,
Hmm.
right? So what was $5,000 may now be $40,000, but it's still not enough to move because everything else has gotten more expensive too. So it's also kind of relative to the broader housing crisis, right? Like what that
Exactly.
means. Yeah.
Exactly. So many of us can relate to that.
Yeah.
And then finally, here from Jody Landers, it seems that many cities are moving to limit or eliminate single family housing zoning in favor of high density rental developments. Will this reverse decline? I was
Um,
thinking about that too with more maybe multifamily, but
yeah. Interesting question. I mean, in it's hard to even to get enough investment for, let's say, infill manufactured housing, right? Like
hmm.
let alone like a big complicated sort of like financing deal for multifamily, right? So I don't think it's a zoning. I think actually Detroit would be pretty open for any developer to have conversations about, oh, you want to develop in Detroit? Great, right? I don't think the zoning is the main barrier there. But it's more the sort of the capital and like, the land's also not that easy, right? It's like kind of fractured, right? Um, so I don't think that that's the main barrier there. I think, yeah, I think we need to be more creative about, well, what can sort of infill development or like what can that look like, right? Or how can we kind of go towards maybe a denser core of Brightmoor and like and then some other parts become nature, right? Because we don't have to maintain all the infrastructure that way. I was struck when I heard about the eminent domain kind of uh, example that if you offer enough money as a city, like I think a lot of, and you offer people kind of options, you may be surprised by kind of how many like are willing to kind of like let go, especially because a lot of homeowners are older, right? So like as long as it's sort of based on trust and ongoing conversations and there's enough kind of money offered, right? Like that could be it's an interesting example of like that could be a way of sort of um repurposing that land, I guess, and having development. Yeah.
Yes, so much from this conversation. And so thank you all for your questions. And Sharon did provide a link to the book and also a discount code that's running right now. So hopefully you all saw that as well. Sharon, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
presentation. I know my mind is still going with a lot of questions, so I might call you afterwards, but we really appreciate it. And with that, Jenny Brown from our NCST team our policy team will provide some regulatory and legislative updates because like there's not too much happening, right? There's a lot happening. I'm being funny, but there's a lot happening. So with that, Jenny, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Raquel. Yes, and thank you, Sharon, for such a great presentation and insightful knowledge. So just things happening at the federal level. So you may have heard of this 21st Century Road to Housing Act. So the Senate passed this act last week, and it was a landmark legislation that serves kind of as a reconciliation of several House and Senate priorities. And it focuses on a whole array of different provisions that both the Senate and the House had their own bills and priorities that set out a lot of these specific provisions. And I'll actually add into the chat a letter that we at NCST had sent out to leadership that specifically outlines all of our priorities and also different tweaks that we're really championing for that Senate version, but also now as it goes over to the House. And so following the Senate's vote, the legislative focus right now has shifted back to the House for a final alignment and formal reconciliation process. So right now, hopefully, there's bipartisan negotiations occurring that resolve any of the differences that the House may be experiencing, having now the Senate's version of the bill. We anticipate there being a lot of variety and kind of differences that the House has in response to the Senate's package that passed. And so we're hoping that a package does get approved sooner rather than later. And so we are kind of looking out for that and also having a lot of conversations with folks at the House to be able to get that through, and with also a lot of our NCST priorities, specifically around investor provisions, just aimed at curbing investor activity and housing supply and those processes as well. Additionally, there's some action coming out, just executive action. There was a recent executive order titled Removing Regulatory Barriers to Affordable Home Construction. So we were definitely very interested in that. And so this order directs federal agencies, including HUD and EPA, to conduct a 90-day review of federal mandates that contribute to the rising cost of starter home production. So we are definitely interested in everything EO related out of the executive office, just in our work. And so let me actually add in while we have up here the letter that we sent out that highlights our priorities for the folks that are a little more interested in the particulars of the different provisions that we have really been looking at that include home investment partnership program changes, as well as support for housing counseling, CDBG, and others. But with that, Raquel, is there anything else we need to touch on?
Great. No, that's wonderful. It gives us a little bit of a heads up for what our April community impact briefing will be diving into. So lots more housing policy in next month's community impact briefing. Thank you so much, Jenny, for those updates, and thank you all for participating today. Please also send us ideas if there's anything that you'd like to hear us bring to our network. Please feel free to get in touch with any of us. Have a great day, great afternoon, folks. Thanks. Bye-bye.